your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. Thanks so much for joining us. In this special Remembrance Day edition of BCN, we wish to pay tribute to the incredible men and women who fought for our freedoms. This Remembrance Day, in addition to wearing a poppy and laying a wreath, you might want to keep your eyes to the skies. A local pilot who restored an old warplane will be doing a flyby over the November 11th ceremonies in Stirling, Raymond, Coaldale, and Lethbridge, Alberta. I went out to see the refurbished plane for myself and to talk to its owner. It never saw any action overseas, but this little bird was nicknamed the Pilot Maker. That's because in its heyday, this Harvard Mark IV was one of the aircraft that trained Canadian fighter pilots, so you could say it still did its part to help fight for world freedom. And this Remembrance Day, it will do its part to remind us all of those who were lost.
So I like to do it just as a tribute to everyone that served in the military. It's a privilege to be a custodian of these airplanes.
Its owner, Jeffrey Brain, purchased the plane several years ago and rebuilt it himself.
Well, I've always been an advocate of I love old airplanes. I love the history, particularly warbirds. We heard about this one. It was in a hangar in Tisdale, Saskatchewan. Been abandoned for 25 years. So we took it apart, trucked it home to Lethbridge, spent about a year with some good friends and a good maintenance department here in Lethbridge, QL Aviation, and we restored it back to the way it was when it was retired in 1966.
You may have seen Brain and his Harvard over the southern Alberta skies. The past 4 Remembrance Days, it's done a fly past over the cenotaph during the November 11th ceremony. And this year is no exception.
We'll do Lethbridge, Stirling, Raymond, and Coaldale. We started doing it when we restored the airplane 4 years ago, and I was surprised. We flew it the first year, I think 2021, and the number of phone calls I got after we flew the Remembrance Day and people approaching us, just how much it meant, because they had someone, some family member either flying the airplane or had worked on the airplane, an uncle. And so I realized it was significant for people to see a bit of history and a bit of a connection to family members.
His co-pilot this year is former Canadian snowbird and retired Captain David Deere, who served for 17 years flying fighter jets. He and Brian, together with the Hornet, will leave a contail in remembrance of those we should not forget. For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Roche. And speaking of warplanes, there's a unique museum in the town of Nanton, Alberta, that honors our Canadian Air Force and features some incredible aircraft. It's called the Bomber Command Museum of Canada. In part 2 of our series on the museum, BCN's Heidi Echeverria examines all that the museum has to offer, including how many women were part of the bomber's history.
So here at Bomber Command Museum of Canada, which is a national memorial, we have the 10,800 names of the Canadians killed in bombers in World War II. Not only do we have their names, we have each individual man's story here. So when families come to us, and I had an uncle in World War II in bombers, we can tell them the whole story of their uncle.
Without those places or people who tell us or remind us of what humanity has been through, the history we know today would be forgotten. That is why places like the Bomber Command Museum of Canada in Nanton, Alberta, can be considered a human and historical bastion with which we reinforce a slogan like, "Lest we forget."
Canadians and British fly their bombers at night, so paint them black. Daytime is American job, nighttime is British and Canadian job. He's the guy that sits in the nose, and the pilot is helping him get to the target, and he's saying, left, left, steady, steady, right. You know, they want to get right dead on, and when they're right over the target, bomb's gone.
This memorial museum has one of only 4 running Lancaster in the world. The museum is also working on the reconstruction of the Halifax and also has other planes and vehicles used before and during the World War II. The Bomber Command Museum of Canada also has many true stories to tell about the Second World War and its protagonists. The Bomber Command Museum of Canada is open to the public on Saturdays and Sundays. For Bridge City News, I'm Heidi Echevarria.
You can find both parts of Heidi's story on our website, bridgecitynews.ca. After the break, we examine the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder on soldiers, what the government still needs to do to help veterans, and how one uses his faith to overcome his burdens. Plus, a special interview with this year's Silver Cross mother. All that next. Don't go away. Chris Golding is a Canadian veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, was hit by 3 roadside bombs, and lost some dear comrades and friends. Up next, he shares his ordeal and his testimony about how he's been able to cope with his post-traumatic stress disorder.
I knew right from a very young age that God put me on this earth to serve. At 17 years old, I joined the Royal Canadian Artillery and served for 21 years going forward. Opportunity arose while I was a reservist in Victoria to deploy to Bosnia as a peacekeeper with the United Nations. At the age of 22, I deployed with a fiance at home, and I did a 7-month deployment in the Balkans. It just solidified me even further of why I was put on this earth. It was to do more, it was to serve. Shortly thereafter, I deployed to Afghanistan in 2006. Deployment to Afghanistan was the first combat tour that Canada did since Korea. And to put it bluntly, our mission was to kill, capture, and convert Taliban. I lost 2 of my best friends on that deployment. And then I came home, and I wasn't done. Despite being blown up twice in one day, June 6, 2006, on my first deployment. I went back again in 2009. I was blown up a 3rd time by a roadside bomb on that deployment 30 days before my son was born. Freedom comes with sacrifice. That I pray every day in hopes that Canadians would truly begin to understand what it is. Due to the condition in which Canada is in, there's a very negative tone towards veterans and what we've been a part of and what we have stood for. For me, Remembrance Day is about God. It's about Him wrapping His arms around me and letting me know just to let it go, son. And now for me, Remembrance Day is quite simply putting on my tunic and my medals like before, but now I will humbly walk the halls through church on 2 Sundays prior and go home. Because for me, Remembrance Day is about remembering my grandfathers. And it's about remembering Miles Mansell. It's about remembering Nicola Goddard. And it's understanding that they are with Father God right now. If anything, I just wish and pray that Canadians would know that there was a hard-fought war in Afghanistan. No qualms about it. It was not peacekeeping. It was hell. 158 good men and women did not make it home. And those good men and women have families, have parents, have brothers, have sisters, have children. And then that sacrifice will run deep for generations to come. Freedom. It's not free.
Ooh, that's powerful stuff. And speaking of PTSD, many veterans don't find their way out of that debilitating ailment. And Maureen Anderson knows this all too well. She lost 2 soldier sons to PTSD, but says she is honored to be named this year's National Silver Cross Mother. 78-year-old Anderson will head to Ottawa for the Remembrance Day ceremony, where she will lay a wreath on behalf of mothers who have lost a child during active military duty. PTSD. Anderson has a long family history of serving in the Canadian military. She served as a nurse at the National Defence Medical Centre in Ottawa. Her two sons, Ron and Ryan, served in Afghanistan during the 2000s. Unfortunately, since coming home, both brothers struggled with PTSD and passed away some years later. Anderson spoke to BCN about how she reacted upon finding out she was this year's Silver Cross mother. She says she hopes to use her time in the role to keep speaking about post-traumatic stress disorder and to encourage veterans to get all the help they can.
I was shocked when I heard it. I went, no. And they said, oh, yes, you were. You're going to be a Silver Cross mother. And they said, okay. I said, okay. So here I am in Ottawa right now. And it's quite an honor, let's put it that way. But I was overwhelmed and anxious and, oh my gosh, am I going to do okay? You know, a lot of emotions going through me. The only thing I can say is, you know, go for help. Don't let, you know, don't go through it by yourself. Go for help and go to sessions and, you know, and get all the help and support you can. That's about all I can say about that, really.
When most of us think about Remembrance Day and the war, it's usually the soldiers and veterans themselves who come to mind. But there were so many other people who made sacrifices during wartime, too. For instance, during World War II, thousands of young women across Europe chose to leave behind their homes, their families, and everything they knew to follow their Canadian soldier husbands back to Canada, which was a faraway place some had barely even heard of. These women today are known as the war brides. Although World War II war brides are becoming scarcer, there are still some left among us. In fact, I found a 100-year-old war bride in the small town of Taber, Alberta.
4 years old.
Hazel West reminisces on a life before being Canadian. Today, the only trace of that former self is a slight British accent she's retained after all these years.
I do remember the colors.
There's no way of telling now, but this 100-year-old was once a dancer, actor, and entertainer of the troops in London back in the 1940s. It was during that time, at age 21, she met her husband Russell, a Canadian Air Force pilot based in England.
The white flash indicated that they were in training. The one thing I always said, I would never go on a blind date.
But that's exactly what happened when her best friend set her up with her date's best friend.
The uniform was wonderful. The Canadian uniform was beautiful. If they were still serving, they never got out of uniform.
It wasn't long after that blind double date that the two were wed.
They were sending them home to Canada, so, you know, if you wanted to marry them, you had to do it pretty quick.
Then Russell went back to Canada, and 10 months later, Hazel's world would be forever changed. She was being summoned to board the Aquitania for a transatlantic one-way passage to Canada.
It didn't occur to me where Canada was, the distance. It didn't occur to me that I'd have to leave my mother and my family to come here. When you're in love, does it matter what's going on, you know? And when I got on that massive ship, the Aquitania, the more I realized what I had done.
And once she hit the port of Halifax, it was all aboard a train to Calgary. Hazel finally arrived in Calgary, and when she saw her husband Russell again for the first time on Canadian soil,
I didn't know him. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't wearing his cap and his uniform. I didn't know him out of uniform.
And he wasn't the only thing that seemed different. This cultured city gal was now facing life with her new husband in tiny Raymond, Alberta, where she says she felt isolated and terrified.
I cried and cried, just flop onto the bed and just howl. I want to see my mother, I want to see my brother, I want to see London.
Not just the loss of London, but it was the loss of the person she was becoming, her good job back home, and her dancing career.
It was the greatest loss of my life.
But it was a similar tale for many of the young women known today as war brides, according to Lynn Martin McCann, president of the Canadian War Brides and Families Association.
My mom went to a farm and in April, and there was no indoor heating. It was a Booker stove in the living room and a cook stove in the kitchen. And they had an outdoor facility. So it was pretty difficult.
The Canadian War Brides and Families Association has close to 100 war brides currently registered with them, and the organization celebrates their many contributions to Canada.
Some of them were teachers, some of them were nurses, and so they found jobs here in Canada, but they contributed to the communities, many, many of them.
And although life was so difficult and lonely in her early years of marriage, Hazel and her husband Russell went on to have 75 years together, 5 children, grandchildren, and now has great and even great-great-grandchildren. And though she's always longed for Mother England, she credits Canada with providing her the opportunity to get educated. And she had the chance to pull out her dancing shoes again, becoming a performing arts teacher in her later years. For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Roche. A crosswalk honoring veterans in Hamilton, Ontario has become the inspiration of many communities across the country. That crosswalk is located at the corner of King Street East and Highway 8 in Stony Creek. The pictures and video of the crosswalk have since gone viral, with Canadians in a number of other cities saying they'd like to create something similar. Now, a certain city councillor in Lethbridge is looking to do the same. Ryan Parker joined BCN's Hal Roberts to tell him the wheels are in motion to create something similar here in Lethbridge.
Now, Ryan, we have a number of veterans who live in Lethbridge, and you want to see something very similar painted possibly by what, the cenotaph downtown?
It just looked really classy. And when I saw it, I said, we need to do something like that in Lethbridge. It's kind of, it's just, why not? It's hard to believe we didn't do something like this sooner.
So obviously you're going to work with the Legion on a concept. What has to happen before you can really present this to council?
You know, it's funny, in the private sector, or if it was your house, you would do it instantly within the next day. But when you work within a corporation like the city of Lethbridge, like any other municipality, there's process. And we want to make sure we do it correctly, because I believe there was a bit of pushback when it wasn't done properly up north. And so I think it's important that we work in consultation with our local branch of the Royal Canadian Legion to make sure it's done properly, because we don't want to do anything that might be offensive. So that's what the resolution states.
So Ryan, you're hoping to have this crosswalk painted sometime this year. How soon can we make it happen?
I would like to have done it yesterday, and if not yesterday, but we have to have process here, Hal. And so I need to take the resolution to council, and the resolution is complete. I can forward it to you when it gets ratified by the agenda committee. But right now, it's the earliest I can put it on the agenda would be the 12th of November. Now, of course, that's the day after Remembrance Day. But I think if we do this, we can do it in the month of November, and I think we can do it year round. So it isn't something that's just going to be temporary. I like to see it as permanent in our community.
And what about costs? Have you looked into that as well on behalf of the taxpayer?
Well, you know, most organizations who do these in our community, different organizations, they usually do it out of pocket, out of their organization. But I don't think we have to make the Legion pay for this. I think the taxpayers would be more than happy to sponsor something like this. And from what it sounds like, it's going to be under $10,000. So my resolution says to a maximum of $10,000.
Thanks so much for your time today, Ryan. That was Lethbridge City Councillor Ryan Parker, who will be presenting a resolution on November 12th of creating a crosswalk honoring our veterans here in Lethbridge.
By the way, Councillor Ryan Parker will be bringing that resolution forward to City Council possibly November 12th to see if there can be a veterans crosswalk painted by the cenotaph downtown for next year. Meanwhile, the city of Cochrane, Alberta, just outside Calgary, has also followed the lead of that Hamilton crosswalk. The new crosswalk resembles the current one in Hamilton, with red and white horizontal stripes and a silhouette of a soldier with the words, "Lest we forget." The mayor of Cochrane says the new addition to the streets is permanent.
The cool part about this was Hamilton, as you mentioned, did a crosswalk just like the one we have built. We saw social media posts from residents that were saying, hey, why can't we do something like that? Our administration sprung into action, went to the operations team. They said, if the weather cooperates, we can certainly do it. And within a few days, it was planned. We had stencils, we had a contractor in place, and boom, it happened in a matter of 6 hours yesterday afternoon. What I would share with other municipalities, do it. Don't overthink it. Don't get down in the weeds and overthink this. Just get it done, and you'll be happy with the results.
Remembrance Day is a time to remember the many sacrifices paid by our soldiers to allow us to enjoy the freedoms we have today. And it's also a good time to review how a society and our government treat veterans and their families. Earlier in the week, I was joined by Wayne King, a retired Canadian Forces colonel and service officer for the Lethbridge Royal Canadian Legion. Mr. King discusses the many challenges facing veterans today, including PTSD, ongoing medical support, and how the Canadian military is in desperate need of more federal funding. Take a look.
Well, the needs of the veteran community are wide-ranging, and it depends on the experience of the individual veteran in service. When we talk about veteran disabilities and so on, we must remember that it's not only those who suffered a disability during a time of active warfare, but also in the so-called peace years. I question the use of peacetime because in many respects, it is a war. We have to be prepared for war to prevent war. And but the needs vary a great deal. Those suffering from disabilities such as PTSD and so on are equally disadvantaged, and in many cases more so than those who have suffered loss of limb or eyesight, as an example. And the needs vary from ongoing medical support to full care in many cases.
Yeah.
So it's varied, but very real to the veteran community.
Yeah, and you mentioned PTSD there, and we hear these stories of veterans struggling with it. And so what would you like to see changed in the way help is being offered to these situations and these veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder?
During the last number of years, the amount of support being provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs and so on has increased significantly. But we must always remember that there is a degree of bureaucracy involved, one which makes it difficult in some cases for the veteran to access the support that's available, or at least to understand the programs that are available. The support is there, but sometimes access to it lacks the speedy application that we'd like to see.
What would you say to a young person watching right now who might be considering a career in the armed forces?
I must admit that my view of the military and the value of the military life dates back now many decades. It's a different world now with the technology available to our society and so on, a technology that wasn't even thought of when I first joined, let alone be available. I would, however, continue to advocate that the youth of our community certainly seriously consider a role or an active participation in the military, if not in the regular services, then through the reserves. The benefits are enormous: self-discipline, training, education, and so on. And I think it's well worthwhile. I would suggest to the society as a whole that our military right now is very, very vulnerable to any armed conflict. We have gone through a number of years where the governments of the day have decided not to come up with adequate funds to equip the military, to enable the military to man its various responsibilities, and to prepare not only the military, but also our society in general for conflict, which unfortunately over time will be on our doorstep.
Yeah. Are there any areas that you'd like to see the government spend more money on, since you think that our soldiers aren't currently properly equipped?
Well, just to give you a couple of examples. Okay. When I retired, or in the time that I was thinking about retiring, I was part of the staff officers in Ottawa was commenting on the next generation of aircraft, fighter aircraft, the Air Force. That was in the late 1970s. And the aircraft was the F-18. Well, that was the aircraft we bought. But and we're still flying it 50 years later. The grandchildren of the officers who participated in the analysis of Canada's need at the time are the active pilots on those aircraft. Grandchildren are flying them. That kind of hardship or that kind of lack of updated military equipment is true also of the Army and of the Navy.
Yeah, it's a little scary when you think about it.
Well, right now, Canada is undermanned for our responsibilities. We are under-equipped, under-trained, and I fear to say we are unprepared for what may come down the road and face us.
Leading up to Remembrance Day, the Lethbridge Hurricanes honored our veterans by hosting Military Appreciation Night on Wednesday in a matchup against the Medicine Hat Tigers. BCN's Landon Hickok has the details.
Veterans and military personnel were honored at the visitlethbridge.com arena on Wednesday night during a matchup between Southern Alberta rivals, the home team Lethbridge Hurricanes and the visiting Medicine Hat Tigers. The pre-game ceremony featured a tribute to the 100-year anniversary of the Royal Canadian Air Force, with a member partaking in the ceremonial face-off. All members in attendance, including military members credited with free admission, took part in a moment of silence following the presentation of the color guard.
I can't thank them enough, and it was great to see them in the stands a lot too on the Jumbotron. I think that was quite special, and I think our guys in the room are very appreciative for everything that they do for us, and we wouldn't be able to do the things that we do if it hadn't been for them. So happy to honor them tonight and get a win in front of them for sure.
For Bridge City News, I'm Landon Hickok.
Off the topic of Remembrance Day, the internet has connected us to a global community, which sometimes mean you could become the victim of cybercrime. After the break, Stephen Graham, computer technology instructor at Lethbridge Polytechnic, shares how to recognize those suspicious email messages, which can put our computer and personal information into the hands of criminals.